I wanted to talk a bit about composing for film, and the example I'm using in this is specifically from A Switch by Graham Woods. If you've not seen it yet, I'll put a link somewhere, because this might get a bit spoilery, so do check it out before you watch this. I wrote the score. I don't normally compose for film. People who normally compose for film have a certain musical literacy, which means they can write to a brief. I don't really have that literacy, although I am working on improving my musicality, my understanding of music and theory. I tend just to work in a more sort of experimental way. For that reason, I only really write score or sound design for films that have the right sort of mood, and a lot of what I do tends to be dark, synthesizer based, found sounds based, and not very cheerful. I've not been asked to score a comedy yet, and at the moment I probably wouldn't do it. That being said, I've worked with Graham before. He knows what I do and he likes what I do, so we agreed I would score A Switch, and what we did was we used a combination of tracks that already existed and wrote some new tracks specifically for the film, and I want to talk about those. So this is one of my sessions. I use Logic Pro. Because it's a mixture of existing tracks, some of the tracks are just in here as straightforward WAV files, which everything got pulled in together and mixed with the dialogue. The dialogue went through a process of cleaning, improving, compressing, all that good stuff. In another session, several other sessions, but this session was specifically for the score, especially for the new pieces of score that were written for the film. The main new element was a theme for Gillian, the main character, played by Sam. And when we see the start of the film, Sam is dealing with grief and she's trapped in this sort of never-ending cycle of grief, and a lot of the music that I make isn't rhythmical, but I wanted rhythmic elements for this film because I wanted that sense of her being trapped in her own grief, and I thought it would be fun to use some natural sounds that were recorded on location as the basis for her theme. So I'll just play a bit of her theme so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. So that's what I mean about having this repeating loop. It gives it a sense of rhythm even though it's not, there's no percussion or drums or anything like that. Okay, so I'll solo the first one. So it's kind of a white noise that's swelling, and what that actually is the kettle boiling that you see in the first scene. So it's a direct recording of that wild track that was taken on set. I thought it'd be fun if we could make that into something that was appropriate for the scene. So I've added several more layers, and what I'm going to do is take the processing off them just to prove to you that it is just a kettle. That's stretched actually, that's why it sounds weird, but I mean I think it's pretty obvious that is a kettle, and then it loops. Essentially it's a lot of reverb, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment, downshifting in pitch just to give it a bit more of a sort of rumbly texture, and a bit of an EQ. I'll take that cycle off. There is one other element, if I just skip to it. What I decided, because I've been watching too many videos on how to write film score, was Gillian needed a leitmotif or a theme that's actually specifically her theme, and that sort of ghostly vocal is her theme. And the reason I chose that is it's actually her girlfriend's voice saying "I love you," and you know, spoilers, her girlfriend is dead and she's driven by this pervasive grief. So sort of hiding her girlfriend's voice as a loop within that seemed like a sensible thing, a sensible way of expressing that actually what's at the core of her character is still her grief. And it's a little bit obvious, but I tend to use that as signposting. Not there, but generally when we see her girlfriend, we see her on the fridge, and then I think we see her again next time. Her birthday is referenced on the calendar, so that's the moments when we bring in that leitmotif to actually suggest Mel's influence on Gillian and what that means to her as a character. Okay, so I mentioned reverb. Let's get one of them up. Yes, that one will do. This is a bit risky for me to talk about because I feel like I'm essentially giving away the secret of about 90% of the atmospheric stuff I do. I use a lot of what's called convolutional reverb or impulse response reverb. Now, traditional reverb, it's basically an echo, a repeat of the original sound. And historically that would have been done by inciting a vibration in something like a spring or a metal plate. This is a kid's microphone and there's a spring inside. And if I talk into it, you get that echo because I've excited a vibration in the spring and it keeps going for a while. That's one way, that's a traditional way of making reverb. The other is you can actually do what's called an impulse response, which is put an impulse, which could be a clap, or more typically it's done as a frequency sweep. I'll see if I can put one here. This is what an impulse response frequency sweep sounds like. And what that's doing is it's the same as a clap. A clap is a spike. It contains every frequency within limits. So what happens is you get an echo back of every frequency. So what that's telling you is how every frequency echoes in that space. If you then record that response, that's your impulse response. You can then put that into an impulse response reverb and convolve it with your dry signal, your original signal. And it's been a while since I did signal processing, but convolution is, I think, a multiplication in the frequency domain. But what you're kind of doing is smushing together your original signal and your recording of what that space sounds like. So every sample has that space applied to it, so it sounds like it was recorded in that space. That's your traditional impulse response or convolutional reverb. But you don't have to just use an impulse response of a space. You can use any waveform. And Logic Pro has all these amazing impulse responses built in. And they're not just spaces. Some of them are what they call warped effects, drone tones. And what that does, it will add another character on top of your sound to create a more abstract sound. And I use these quite a lot in sound design and in atmospheric music tracks that I write, because I really like the effect that they have. So there you go. If you want to make bone music stuff like I do, it's like loads of convolutional reverb. Okay, so that is the basis of Gillian's theme. The thing I did to sort of hide the leitmotif of Mel saying "I love you" was things like time stretch and reverse the audio, so it's not obvious what it is. The thing about some of these effects is they're destructive editing, so something to bear in mind is check if you're trying it yourself. I went through a whole composition cycle with the actual dialogue of their conversation where Mel says "I love you" with that actually reversed by accident because I forgot it was a destructive process, and so every time we got to that point in the file it was reversed. It's not a problem because it was all backed up and copied, and this is just a rough cut of the dialogue to compose to. But it is worth bearing in mind some of these file editing processes are destructive. Okay, so that is Mel's theme. I have a couple of other themes in the film. One is called Swiss Bells. I'm going to go into the actual session where I created it for a bit more detail, but I'm going to play a bit of that now. At this point in the film, it's during the long conversation that's central, So it's what we call an underscore. It's not meant to have attention drawn to it. It's just to add a sort of general ambience to that conversation. And the reason I chose this as one of my existing tracks, it's kind of mournful at this stage, but it builds into something more hopeful. And I sort of hope that no matter how stuck in grief a character is, there is an element of hope there, because eventually you're going to find things that make it's never going to go away, but it's going to become a bit easier for you to deal with. And that's why I chose this particular track. I will talk a bit more about its creation later. This was actually, I worked as an assistant on a BBC programme called Cormoran Strike, Lethal White, which should be out this year. And we went and filmed in Leicester Square, and they have the Swiss clock there, which strikes every quarter of an hour. And we were recording that as part of the story, but I just held my mobile phone in the air and got my own recording of it, and then very, very heavily processed it to strip out some of the crowd noise that you can hear around it. Slowed it down, and I really liked it. And then it's quite mournful, slowed down, but what I tried to do then was add MIDI elements of instrumentation that sort of complemented it, which is what comes in later when it stops being underscore. So if we get to the bit where it's not underscore, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. Oh, that's quite nice. So even though it's an existing track, it was edited to fit. So like the moment here where the hand goes on the shoulder, you hear some higher notes, and it's just that sense of, here's your life right now, here's how your life is going to be. It's hopeful, it's foreshadowing that this is a really happy, good event when they meet. Well, they meet for the second time, but also I think the cinematography is so beautiful with the haze and the light. I wanted something uplifting to complement that. Izzie did great work, as always. So later in the film, it's the same theme, but it's more prominent. And it's letting some of those bass notes and distortion come through to be threatening, but also letting it build with the orchestral notes. And I really would have liked having the budget to replace the orchestral pieces, the existing MIDI, with real instrumentation. It just wasn't something we could practically do for this film, so I tried my best to make the MIDI sound realistic. What I do sometimes is the MIDI acts as a placeholder, and then either me or someone who's actually a musician will replay the parts. And that's something that I did with Wheel Fall, which is a music track I wrote for a short film, which is based in the Xenox universe that Mr. Biffo wrote. But for one piece that I did for that, I actually I wrote it as a MIDI element, because you can move the notes around until you're happy. It's a very powerful songwriting tool, even though the protocol is very old. But what I then did was got some musician friends to replay the guitar, replay the cello, replay the violin. I played the drums to varying degrees of success. The guy who played guitar also sang on the track, and actually, no matter how you perceive of a song in your mind, when you start bringing in other people and other ideas, it can really lift it to something else. And you've got to be willing to sort of let it go, let it grow, let it develop, and it'll either work or it won't, but it can be so powerful to get other people involved and actually have their input and use their skills and take things in a different direction. I couldn't afford to do it for this, but I'm actually happy with the result, and Graham's happy, so I call that a win. So we have the moment of the switching. So what I did there was sort of let the orchestral moments build, then have a moment of almost silence to build a bit of tension, and then at the moment of the switch we have distortion, and it gives that unsettling atmosphere. But again, we talked earlier about having rhythmical elements and repetition to show that Gillian's stuck in this cycle. So one of the things that I did there was to reuse the same switch. It's the kettle switch again, but it was treated so it wasn't quite so obviously a kettle switch, but I wanted it to sound similar, and I wasn't just being lazy. It was a planned choice. We switch scene and it's cheerful, but I let the slightly unsettling music continue fractionally underneath. And again, that was a choice because, you know, this isn't necessarily the happy ending. Then we get on to the end when it's definitely not happy, and this was another existing piece called South Spiral, and it's a mixture of a bunch of different elements, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it was recut to fit the scene. I wanted to keep some of the heavier, more rumbly elements out of the dialogue because they're a bit distracting. That vocal, again, sometimes we're using Gillian's leitmotif, but also it's not just Mel's voice now that we have this threat to Gillian. Gillian's voice is in there as well, so I wanted to kind of echo back to the first scene with a slight difference. So it's the same idea and it's tying it back to the first scene, so that's a new element within an existing track, but it's different because now the threat has changed. And then we get into the titles proper, and this is all South Spiral, this is all the existing track now, which I'll talk about in a sec. So let's just open up. Still with me? This is quite long, isn't it? I just want to pull out a few points from the individual tracks that I mentioned. This is Swiss Bells that I mentioned earlier. If I just solo one of the elements, this is the actual field recording of the bells, and it's got a lot of processing on it, in addition to being time stretched a lot. There's distortion and there's denoise to get rid of some of the sounds of the people chatting around Leicester Square. Pitch correction, so pitch correction is to kind of keep it within a scale, but there's also pitch shift, which is taking it all down, low frequency. A bit of chorus. Chorus tends to smooth through distortion quite nicely. If I just take everything off, we can see what it sounds like just stretched. It sounds a lot more like bells. But you can also hear that sort of chattery electronic artifact, which is a result of it being stretched so much, and I kind of wanted to smooth through that as well. So that's the EQ back on, distortion, denoise, pitch correction. This is basically your auto-tune, so, and you can sort of hear that wobble, which is the auto-tune trying to quickly pull it back to a pitch within a scale. Pitch shift, smooth it off with a bit chorus, another pitch shift, another pitch shift. So that's the main component of the track. What's that? What else do we have? Oh, this is, I think that was a recording of a power station in Benidorm. Obviously. That's just a very quiet sort of synthesizer oscillator, really low frequency, just sort of popping its way. Then we get into all of the MIDI components. And the attack is quite soft because Graham didn't want it to be as in your face as it was in the original track. So you get a bit of softer transition from the atmospheric sounds into the actual composed element. But what I was trying to do here was find notes that really balanced the bells and timing that really balanced the bells, and that was quite difficult because it's got to be soft and subtle but building. I'll just open one of these up. So in MIDI it's just a small number of notes, and these different colours represent the attack velocity of the MIDI. And if you imagine, like, if you were bowing a violin, you bow very gently, or you sort of really dig in. This red would be where you were digging in, and the blue, the light blue, light green would be where you're playing very gently. So you can sort of humanise your MIDI to some extent with that sort of thing. Although I don't have the best sample patches in the world because it's not primarily what I do. And being MIDI, you can just go through and change to different sounds, different instruments until you find what you're happy with. So you can spend days on just experimenting, and it's both a blessing and a curse, but it's extremely powerful to be able to do that. Okay, I'm going to see if I can find one last thing, which is Self Spiral, which is the outro track. The problem with that is I don't remember what I called it. That's really not Graham's film, is it? Okay, that confused me by being called exactly what it was supposed to be called. Okay, this is the last track that I mentioned. This is called Self Spiral. It's mostly a mixture of various atmospheric recordings, unsurprisingly including quite a lot of convolutional reverb. One that I particularly like one recording that I particularly like is this train tunnel. So I was working on a short film and we were in a sort of archway under a railway track, and when the train went under, it was a really dramatic, bassy, unsettling sound. So I've used that quite a lot in this track. These heavy piano notes I recorded when I was at East Surrey College for about a year when I first quit my job to work in sound. And there's a broken piano outside one of the studios, and we had a very happy afternoon basically hitting it and recording what happened. And I've been keeping it since, until eventually I found a home for it. So there's a few bits of that I've made it in, and it's quite eerie, I like it. And there's a cement mixer, and what's that? I think that's a synth. Yeah, that's one of the synths in Logic Pro called Alchemy, which is brilliant. And one of the things you can do is put in photographs, and it'll give you a sound synthesis based on the brightness and colour translates into sort of frequency and amplitude. So we played a lot with that to get these very sort of sparse soundscapes. So there's a few of them in there. There's also a fridge that kept me awake one night when I was in a hotel because it sounded very much like the TARDIS, and every few hours I would leap out of bed with my phone because I thought it was about to do the TARDIS thing and invariably miss it. I think I did eventually get it. I'm just going to skip forward. Does it do the TARDIS thing? So it makes a noise like a TARDIS and then it powers down. That was basically one night in a hotel when I was working on another film project. So yeah, a lot to process there. We've got the piano again, but played in reverse, so you get that noise because the attack of the sound is in the wrong place. It's backwards attack, running backwards quickly. I don't know what you call it, reversed anyway. Also, you've got we're building to a crescendo with the train tunnel, and also we've got a young actress saying stop. It was actually for an anti-bullying film for a mental health charity for young people, and it was all about cyberbullying, and her performance was great. And I think on top of all this unsettling sound design, it just is creepy and unpleasant, and creepy and unpleasant is where I'm at.